What's up, everyone? Let's talk Black Clover. Episode 2 just dropped, and it was a pretty much fully flashback episode. I had, I think, a couple scenes from like modern time in the main series timeline, but it was mostly a flashback episode, flashing back 10 years before to Asta and Yuno as kids. Yuno was sent on a mission and attacked. Asta tried to protect him, was not able to do so, but they agreed that they would be rivals, and they would both try to be king of the wizards. And then we flash to present day, where we pick up the story from last episode, where Yuno is getting attacked and Asta comes to save him, gets his grimoire, and then at the end they both say that they are going to remember the promise and remain rivals with one another. Basically the gist of what happened in this episode. It was kind of a gutsy move to go with flashback. I personally enjoyed it. I like building backstory early on so you get a little bit better of an understanding of the characters. I wish we had a little bit more time with the characters other than just the first episode. I would have liked if they did this maybe next week or episode 4, because we're not super familiar with Asta and Yuno other than the basic setup. Asta is Naruto, Yuno is a rival. We don't know who he's really the closest to in terms of like the rival archetypes yet, because he's really not like Sasuke. He's also not like Vegeta. We'll see what he ends up becoming as the series goes on. But Asta, pretty much your stereotypical shonen protagonist in terms of the end goal that he's aiming for. Like Naruto, he wants to be basically the most well-respected and highest of power within his specific trade, I guess would be the best way to say it. Luffy also, but not quite a one-to-one comparison, as I think Asta's a little bit less likable at this point, but hopefully it gets a little bit better as it goes on. But it was a gutsy move to go with flashback backstory this early on. I really enjoyed this episode. I think that this episode kind of renewed a lot of what I wanted to see out of the show. The first episode was a little bit deterring just because it's super, like I talked about in that video, it's pretty much a one-for-one, not one-for-one, but a basic copy of the first episode of Naruto. This episode went in a little bit different of a direction where it's trying to build up the characters a little bit more so than it did in the first episode, where it just set up who these characters are, how they function. Now, it did further the fact that Asta is pretty much a knucklehead. He's just a typical character. But I think that it did a lot for showing the relationship between Asta and Yuno, because I don't think it really showed enough of that other than that they didn't get along now. Like currently within the main series storyline, that they weren't really great friends anymore, even though we had seen that they were together from birth, and Asta, said it several times in the first episode. This did a good job of actually affirming that relationship, showing things that had happened between them to make it get to the point that it's at now, instead of just being like, well, when they were born they were together and now they don't really like each other. So I like that it did a lot to build that relationship as well. I thought the animation in this episode was also spectacular, especially the scene where Yuno gets attacked. I thought was really well animated. Animation was one of the things I was kind of keeping my guard up for, because me and Piero have a really, not love-hate, but like a mixed relationship, because I really like Yu Yu Hakusho. I think that's one of the better animated shows from the 90s, but Naruto I always thought was a little lackluster in terms of animation, and Bleach I kind of went back and forth on over time. Sometimes it was really good, sometimes it was kind of and I hadn't really seen a lot of their other shows. Those were like the 3 shows I had the most experience with, and then episode 1 of this series was kind of spotty at times in terms of animation, so I was really happy to see that they did a really good job on this episode. I also think that they scaled back Asta's voice a little bit. I think that they probably realized that they went overboard in episode 1, and a lot of this episode does take place in the past, so he does have a different voice, but in the scenes that take place in present day, I think that his voice was a little bit more improved. There was less yelling, there was less enunciating, no more hanging on the last syllable, or not as much at least. It was still present, but just not to the extent that it was before. So I definitely think that this was an improved episode in terms of those aspects, and there wasn't really a whole lot I didn't like about this episode. I was actually really impressed by the improvement that it made, for me at least, between the first episode and the second episode. The only thing I will say that I really don't like so far is the one-sided courting of Sister Lily by Asta, because it's just kind of annoying right now, because I would say a good 95+% of the character interaction between Sister Lily and Asta up to this point is Asta just begging her to marry him, and it's really not interesting. They're not building it up in a very interesting way at all. They don't really show a whole lot to that relationship. It's kind of just Asta being a little punk and just screaming at her over and over again, which isn't really interesting. It's just a gimmick that they kind of been using, and I'm not really super on board with so far. We'll have to see how it develops over the course of the series. It looks like that is going to be your like relationship that's set up from the very beginning. There's not always relationships like that in these series, but just based on earlier turns, it seems how that's going to turn out. I will say I have not read the manga, so I don't know anything that's happened outside of these 2 episodes. I said this in my last video, I'll reiterate it now, and I'll probably have to say this in all of these reviews, but I will read the manga if these first 13 episodes are interesting enough for me to get involved in the story. And so far, I have not been able to make a definitive ruling. Episode 1, solely based on that, no, it wouldn't have been interesting enough. But this episode really turned me on to these characters a lot more. And now I feel like I'm a lot more invested in following their story because I have a little bit more background on the relationship between these 2 characters and how these 2 characters interact and who they are. I obviously wouldn't be 100% invested in these characters at this point. You're not supposed to start off knowing everything. After this episode, though, I do feel a little bit more attached to the characters, more so than episode 1 made me feel. So it's not any secret. I think that this episode is I would dare say, drastic improvement over the first episode. The first episode was incredibly formulaic. It was almost a copycat. It was just not really super interesting in terms of characters or story. It was just, oh, you want to be the king, you don't have powers. Hey, you're not going to get powers. Oh, now you have powers. This episode was a lot of world building, character development, backstory, all these things that I would be interested in early on in the show to kind of develop my attachment to the world and the characters. So I was really a big fan of this episode, and this episode turned me on a little bit more so than I would have been to the rest of the series. And now I think this is going to be a must-watch at least for the next couple weeks, whereas if this episode hadn't really improved on episode 1, I probably would have been like, it's okay, but I'll definitely keep it on the back burner. Now I'm really invested, and I want to see where they go with this going forward. So I would give this episode a 8. It's probably more of a 7.5, but just because this delivered a little bit more on what I expected out of the series than the first episode, I would push it up just that little half bit to an 8. That's my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think of this episode. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Was it an improvement? Did it take a step back for you over episode 1? How are you feeling after 2 episodes? Is this a show you think that you're going to be really invested in? What do you think of the characters? What do you think of the world? How's the story doing for you? Let me know all of that down below in the comments section. I gave my thoughts. I want to hear yours. That's going to do it for me. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for more Black Clover.